30 September 1999, Tokai-mura, Ibaraki Prefecture, Japan, 10:35 in the morning. In JCO's conversion test building, a stainless steel bucket dips into uranyl nitrate solution, 18.8% enriched uranium-235. An operator lifts it, walks several steps, pours the contents into a precipitation tank not designed for this purpose. No alarm sounds. The facility has no criticality alarm. Designers believed such an accident impossible. The tank now holds more than 16 kilograms of enriched uranium, 7 times the safety limit, in unfavorable geometry, surrounded by a water-filled cooling jacket. At this moment, the neutron balance shifts. A process vessel becomes a critical assembly. 3 workers stand within meters of the tank. Over the next 19 hours, a chain reaction will persist. The question investigators will ask is simple. How did a bucket turn a fuel plant into Japan's worst nuclear accident? Late 1980s through mid-1990s. JCO co-mounted Tokaimura, Ibaraki Prefecture. On a wall map at the Science and Technology Agency headquarters in Tokyo, colored pins mark Japan's nuclear installations. Large circles denote power reactors and reprocessing facilities. A small dot represents the JCO fuel conversion plant. No special notation indicates criticality risk. National emergency plans focused on reactor accidents, core damage, containment failure, airborne releases of fission products. Fuel conversion lines using solution processes were considered low-hazard operations. Criticality was judged not credible if operators followed mass limits and used approved vessels. As a result, JCO's conversion test building was not featured prominently in the National Plan for the Prevention of Nuclear Disasters. The facility operated without a criticality alarm system. JCO was a subsidiary of Sumitomo Metal Mining, producing fuel for research reactors and fast breeder programs. The company received uranium hexafluoride, converted it to uranium dioxide and uranyl nitrate solutions, and shipped finished fuel to facilities like Joyo, Japan's experimental fast breeder reactor. Several production lines operated at the Tokai site. The conversion test building handled limited batches of higher enrichment material, up to 18.8% uranium-235, in small quantities under strict administrative controls. Regulatory documents stated that criticality would be prevented by mass limits and vessel geometries, not by active detection and response. Inspection frequency reflected this classification. Emergency drills emphasized reactor scenarios. The CTB rarely appeared in off-site exercise plans. This classification shaped everything: hardware, staffing, oversight intensity. When assumptions failed, those same decisions would determine how quickly the accident was recognized and how effectively authorities could respond. Designers trusted geometry and paperwork more than alarms. The next phase shows how that geometry was meant to work and where its margins were set. 1996 through 1999. JCO Conversion Test Building, Tokai-mura. In a small office adjacent to the process floor, a laminated flow diagram details the approved fuel solution line. Arrows trace the path of enriched uranyl nitrate through dedicated equipment. Licensing documents assume solution will move through piping into a tall, narrow buffer tank, an example of safe geometry. The tank's slender profile ensures that enough neutrons escape the surface, rather than sustaining a chain reaction. Even with 18.8% enriched solution, the configuration remains subcritical. Downstream, the precipitation tank receives carefully metered transfers. This vessel has a strict 2.4 kilogram uranium mass limit, because its wider cross-section and surrounding water jacket create unfavorable neutron economy. Plant design engineers and Science and Technology Agency reviewers approved this arrangement. Safety analysis defined limits on uranium mass and concentration in each vessel. The buffer tank's geometry provided the primary safety barrier. The precipitation tank was treated as a transient process stage, not a bulk storage volume. The approved process began with uranium oxide powder, dissolved in nitric acid in the dissolution tank. Solution was pumped to the tall buffer tank whose diameter and height were chosen to maintain subcriticality. From that safe geometry vessel, measured volumes were transferred to the precipitation tank, where uranyl nitrate was converted back to solid form through chemical precipitation. Safe geometry is a principle. Vessels with limited diameter or slab thickness allow neutron leakage to dominate over multiplication. Contrast this with unfavorable geometry, wider tanks, moderated and reflected configurations that enhance neutron economy and increase multiplication. The precipitation tank fell into the latter category. Its safety case relied on keeping inventory low. Safety analysis summaries stated that criticality control would be achieved by mass limits and geometric controls in each vessel. The precipitation tank's allowable uranium inventory was capped at 2.4 kilograms. The design's defense relied on two pillars: adherence to the specified flow path and respect for mass limits. Deviations in either would invalidate the safety case. On the drawings, the precipitation tank was a limited downstream step. On the shop floor, it would gradually become the main receiving vessel, filled not by pumps, but by buckets. Early 1990s through 29 September 1999. CTB, Tokai-mura. A later generation operating manual lies open on a supervisor's desk. Simplified diagrams replace the original licensing drawings. Text instructs operators to transfer solution by container instead of via the buffer tank. The regulatory basis. Document is missing from the appendix. Regulations required JCO to seek formal approval for significant procedure changes affecting safety. Yet, to simplify work and meet production schedules, the company progressively revised its internal procedures without updating the licensing basis or informing regulators. What began as minor adjustments evolved into a fundamentally different process. The documented workers involved in the final batch were Hisashi Ochi, Masato Shinohara, and supervisor Yutaka Yokokawa. These names appear in investigation reports strictly in their roles as operators and supervisor in the conversion test building. JCO management and internal safety committees are described in official post-accident evaluations and ethics case studies. The drift from design intent occurred gradually. Initial simplifications reduced process steps while nominally respecting vessel limits. Over time, operators adopted stainless steel buckets to move enriched solution directly from the dissolution tank into the precipitation tank, bypassing the buffer tank entirely. Training for new workers was based on this bucket method, not the original approved flow. Supervision by criticality specialists diminished. Documentation no longer clearly showed the buffer tank as the controlling geometry element. Investigation reports later noted that the operating manual had been revised internally without review by competent authorities and that the precipitation tank was improperly used as a receiving tank for enriched solution, charged by portable containers. Each informal change eroded safety margins. Management pressure for throughput, combined with weak configuration control and limited regulatory visibility, allowed a non-licensed process to become normal practice. Inspections focused on paperwork compliance rather than actual floor operations. The gap between design basis and reality widened year by year. On the morning of 30 September 1999, the CTB crew prepared Joyo fuel exactly as their local routine prescribed, by bucket into the wide tank. The next phase follows that routine minute by minute. 30 September 1999. 900 hours through 10:30 hours. Japan Standard Time, JCO Conversion Test Building, Tokai-mura. A stainless steel bucket dips into a dissolution tank holding uranyl nitrate solution, enriched to 18.8% uranium-235. An operator lifts it, carries it several steps across the room, and pours the contents into the precipitation tank. The tank's cooling jacket is filled with water. The licensing basis assumed each batch of enriched solution would be metered through the buffer tank and that the precipitation tank would never hold more than 2.4 kilograms of uranium. In reality, operators prepared multiple bucketfuls and poured them directly into the precipitation tank, accumulating more than 16 kilograms of uranium in unfavorable geometry. Testimony and dose reconstructions by the Nuclear Safety Commission and International Atomic Energy Agency established the workers' positions. Ouchi and Shinohara worked near the tank. Yokokawa remained in an adjacent room. Their relative locations would later inform dose estimates. The reconstructed sequence begins with uranium oxide powder for Joyo fuel dissolved in nitric acid at 18.8% enrichment. Several bucketfuls, each containing approximately 2 to 2.5 kilograms of uranium, were transferred directly into the precipitation tank. The tank's cylindrical geometry combined with water in the cooling jacket created a moderated and reflected configuration. Simple mass balance. Design limit 2.4 kilograms, actual mass exceeding 16 kilograms in solution. Official reports state that the mass limit of 2.4 kilograms uranium for the precipitation tank was grossly exceeded, and that operators had transferred solution directly using buckets, contrary to approved procedure. By bypassing the buffer tank and building up large mass in a wide, water-reflected vessel, operators unintentionally assembled a near-critical solution geometry. The system now depended on conditions remaining just below the threshold. At approximately 10:35, the addition of another bucket changed the neutron balance. The next phase describes how the system crossed from subcritical to supercritical in milliseconds. 30 September 1999, 10:35 Japan Standard Time onward. JCO Conversion Test Building, Tokaimura. Around the time of the seventh bucket, radiation field measurements later reconstructed from activation data indicate a sudden spike consistent with a prompt supercritical excursion in the precipitation tank. No criticality alarm sounds. None exists. The CTB's designers and regulators expected subcritical operation by geometry and mass limits alone. In reality, the tank has become a compact water-reflected solution assembly with sufficient fissile mass to exceed delayed critical conditions. Investigations identify Uchi and Shinohara as being within a few meters of the tank. Yokokawa was positioned in a nearby room. Their relative locations later informed dose reconstructions by the National Institute of Radiological Sciences and other experts. The physics of what occurred can be explained clearly. The addition of the last bucket increased solution height and compactness. Water in the cooling jacket acted as a neutron reflector, effectively returning escaping neutrons to the fissile volume. The system briefly reached prompt criticality, producing a pulse of power equivalent to a large number of fissions in milliseconds. The initial excursion was followed by a 19-hour phase of intermittent criticality, driven by heating, bubble formation, and density changes in the solution. Power oscillations continued until cooling water was drained and boric acid added. The total number of fissions during the 19-hour period was on the order of 2 to 3 times 10 to the 18th power, corresponding to roughly 80 to 100 megajoules of energy. Much of this energy was deposited as heat in the solution and surrounding structures. Local boiling and bubble formation modulated reactivity, producing an oscillatory power history. International Atomic Energy Agency summaries note that criticality continued for about 20 hours until water was drained from the cooling jacket and neutron absorbers were added. The decision to bypass the buffer tank and accumulate mass in the precipitation vessel transformed a non-reactor process into a de facto critical assembly. The lack of a criticality alarm delayed recognition, affecting both on-site actions and off-site protective measures. For the 3 workers, the key consequence was not system behavior measured in megawatts, but local radiation dose measured in sieverts. The next phase examines how those doses were estimated and what they meant medically. 30 September through early October 1999. Conversion test building and medical facilities in Ibaraki and Chiba prefectures. Hospital staff at the National Institute of Radiological Sciences in Chiba review blood samples and initial clinical data from 3 JCO workers evacuated from Tokai-mura. Early lymphocyte counts are critically low. Preliminary dose estimates point to extremely high, potentially lethal exposures. Before the accident, criticality at the CTB was considered so unlikely that no specific medical plans for high-dose neutron exposure from fuel solution accidents existed at local hospitals. Within hours, physicians confronted cases with estimated whole-body doses ranging from several sieverts to more than 10 sieverts, far exceeding typical radiological emergencies. The 3 workers are identified with their estimated effective doses: Hisashi Uchi, approximately 17 sieverts; Masato Shinohara, approximately 10 sieverts; Yutaka Yokokawa, approximately 3 sieverts. These values are reported in official dose reconstructions. The National Institute of Radiological Sciences served as the main treatment center. Doses were reconstructed using multiple methods. Activation of sodium-24 in blood provided direct evidence of neutron exposure. Cytogenetic analysis of chromosomal aberrations estimated absorbed dose in grey. Lymphocyte depletion curves and clinical signs, skin changes, gastrointestinal symptoms, bone marrow failure, supported the estimates. Physical dosimetry at the accident site helped model the radiation field. To provide context, 1 sievert equals approximately 100 rem. A chest X-ray delivers on the order of 0.1 millisievert. The workers' doses were higher by factors of tens of thousands. Whole-body doses above 3 to 4 sieverts often cause severe acute radiation syndrome without aggressive treatment. Doses of 10 to 17 sieverts are typically fatal despite intensive care. Clinical documentation summarized that the estimated doses to Auchi and Shinohara were far beyond those previously encountered in Japan, and that their injuries represented severe mixed neutron and gamma exposure with extensive bone marrow damage. Proximity to the tank at the moment of the initial excursion and during the subsequent criticality phase directly determined the workers' doses and clinical prognosis. The lack of instant recognition and immediate evacuation from the room added to their cumulative exposure. While physicians concentrated on 3 extreme cases, regulators and local officials had to ask a different question. What had the accident done to the surrounding town? 30 September through October 1999. Tokai-mura and surrounding area. Mobile monitoring teams drive slowly through residential streets and past rice fields. Portable neutron and gamma survey instruments record readings higher than background, but far below levels causing immediate health effects. National emergency planning had emphasized large reactor accidents as primary off-site risks. Here, a small fuel facility produced a criticality that prompted the first major evacuation and shelter-in-place orders in Japan's nuclear history. Yet preliminary data suggested relatively low doses to the general public. Local officials, the Science and Technology Agency, and monitoring teams organized by national and prefectural authorities coordinated the response. Surveys of residents were later compiled by organizations including the Citizens Nuclear Information Center. Monitoring data showed that hundreds of residents, JCO workers, and emergency responders were screened for exposure. Maximum recorded effective doses to nearby residents were on the order of tens of millisieverts. Many received well under 10 millisieverts. Dose pathways were dominated by direct and scattered neutron and gamma radiation, sometimes called skyshine, rather than by inhalation of airborne radionuclides. The critical assembly emitted radiation like a small, unshielded reactor rather than dispersing contamination over a wide area. To provide scale, 1 millisievert equals approximately 0.1 rem. Typical annual background radiation is a few millisieverts. The measured off-site doses, while above background and non-negligible, remained far below thresholds for deterministic health effects. Official summaries recorded that approximately 667 people were assessed as having received doses above background levels, but that no deterministic health effects were expected among the general public. The spatial distribution of dose reflected the reactor-like behavior of the critical assembly. Strong fields close to the tank, rapidly diminishing with distance. This pattern drove the shape of evacuation zones and informed later risk communication strategies. Maximum public dose was approximately 21 millisieverts for residents, 48 millisieverts for JCO employees on site, and 9.4 millisieverts for emergency personnel. Even as dose estimates stayed relatively low off-site, the scale of the response, roadblocks, school closures, public briefings, was unprecedented for a fuel facility. The next phase examines how authorities reacted once they realized the radiation source was still undergoing a chain reaction. 30 September through 1 October 1999. Conversion Test Building and Emergency Headquarters, Tokaimura. Inside the CTB, radiation specialists and emergency responders plan an approach route. Portable instruments show the tank is still emitting substantial neutron and gamma fields. Calculations based on decay rates indicate the assembly remains critical. Design and licensing documents had not envisioned sustained criticality in a process vessel. There were no pre-planned engineering procedures to shut down a critical solution tank, only general criticality safety principles adapted on site. The plant's emergency team, national expert groups and regulatory representatives coordinated on-site actions. Official reports document institutional roles rather than individual decision-makers in most cases. Technical steps were developed through rapid assessment. Engineers examined the precipitation tank's state and recognized the contribution of the water-filled cooling jacket as a neutron reflector. Removing the reflector would reduce reactivity. The decision was made to drain the cooling jacket water. Additionally, boric acid, a neutron absorber, would be added to the system to ensure subcriticality. These actions required careful planning. Workers had to approach the still critical assembly to manipulate valves and inject materials. Dose rates in the immediate area remained high. Entry times were limited and carefully coordinated. The criticality persisted for approximately 19 hours from onset. It ended only after the water in the cooling jacket was drained and boron was introduced. This marked the definitive termination of the chain reaction. Investigative bodies later concluded that the chain reaction continued until water in the cooling jacket was drained and boron was introduced. The event was classified as International Nuclear Event Scale Level 4, indicating an accident with local consequences. The absence of a pre-planned shutdown procedure for solution criticality forced ad hoc engineering decisions under pressure. Recognizing the reflector effect of the cooling jacket and applying basic criticality control measures, reducing reflection, adding neutron poison, were decisive in terminating the event. Once the tank was subcritical, attention shifted from immediate control to systematic explanation. The next phase follows how investigators pieced together the process geometry violation that turned a precipitation tank into an unintended critical assembly. October 1999 through 2000. Investigation. Committees in Tokyo and Tokaimura. Around a conference table, investigators lay out vessel drawings, worker testimony, and dose distribution maps. On one sketch, the buffer tank is crossed out. Arrows show bucket paths leading directly into the precipitation tank. Pre-accident analysis treated the precipitation tank as a low-inventory process vessel, used transiently with strict mass limits. Reconstruction showed it had been used as the primary receiving tank for more than 16 kilograms of enriched solution with a surrounding water reflector, conditions never evaluated in the safety analysis. The Nuclear Safety Commission Investigation Committee, International Atomic Energy Agency expert team, and technical staff from Japanese research organizations led the reconstruction effort. Their work produced detailed models of the accident sequence. Reconstruction methods combined multiple information sources. Review of witness statements and surviving records determined the number and size of bucket charges. Calculation of total uranium mass and solution height in the tank produced estimates around 16 to 16.8 kilograms. Neutronic modeling of the tank geometry, solution composition, and water jacket confirmed that criticality was achievable and sustained in this configuration. The technical reconstructions showed visually that the safe geometry buffer tank had been bypassed. An unfavorable vessel with neutron reflection had been used as a storage tank, a configuration lying entirely outside the approved safety envelope. Official summaries note that over 16 kilograms of uranium oxide enriched to about 18.8% uranium. 235 were added to an unfavorable geometry vessel. International Atomic Energy Agency reports emphasize that this configuration lay outside the approved safety envelope and that criticality occurred in a configuration not considered in the safety analysis. The technical reconstructions established that the accident was the logical outcome of specific, identifiable deviations, not an unpredictable anomaly. This insight shifted attention from the physics of criticality to the organizational and regulatory factors that allowed the process geometry violation to develop and persist. Geometry and mass alone did not change. People and organizations did. The next phase traces how safety culture and oversight failed to detect the drift. 1990s through 2001. Corporate and regulatory inquiries across Japan. A stack of internal JCO documents sits beside regulatory correspondence files. Dates on procedure changes do not align with dates on safety evaluations. Some revisions never appear in regulator files at all. Regulatory frameworks expected licensees to update safety analyses and seek approval for significant procedural changes, especially those affecting criticality control. At JCO, changes to operating methods in the conversion test building, including the adoption of bucket transfers, were made without formal safety evaluations or timely notification to authorities. JCO management, safety officers, and regulators at the Science and Technology Agency and Nuclear Safety Commission are discussed in official statements acknowledging organizational failures and oversight gaps. Documented issues included operating manuals revised internally, diverging from licensed procedures without corresponding updates to the safety analysis. Regulatory inspections were infrequent and did not detect or challenge the use of buckets and the bypassing of the buffer tank. Criticality safety training for CTB operators and supervisors was limited. The national regulatory approach placed more emphasis on power reactors than on small fuel cycle facilities, influencing inspection priorities and resource allocation. Post-accident reviews stated that JCO had failed to maintain adequate safety management systems. Regulatory authorities had not fully recognized the risks associated with criticality in fuel fabrication facilities. Inspection programs emphasized documentation review over direct observation of process operations. Organizational and regulatory assumptions that criticality was unlikely, that procedures would be followed as written, that fuel cycle facilities posed minimal public risk, allowed the process geometry violation to develop and persist undetected for years. The accident's root causes extended beyond individual operator errors to systemic weaknesses in safety culture, management oversight, and regulatory supervision. The consequences of those systemic weaknesses were most visible in the clinical course of the three workers. The next phase examines their treatment and what their cases contributed to radiation medicine and emergency preparedness. October 1999 through 2001. National Institute of Radiological Sciences and related medical centers. Medical charts at NIRS track white blood cell counts, skin changes, and organ function over weeks and months for the three exposed workers. Treatment protocols are adjusted daily based on clinical observations. Japan had experience treating patients with moderate radiation exposures from medical accidents and occupational incidents, but not mixed high-dose neutron-gamma injuries at the levels seen at JCO. Standard protocols required adaptation. International expertise was consulted through formal and informal channels. The three workers are presented as documented patients in clinical reports. NR's medical teams and international medical advisors are referenced as institutions providing care and guidance. Key clinical interventions included intensive supportive care, with stringent infection control and blood product transfusions. Attempts at hematopoietic restoration involve peripheral blood stem cell transplantation and umbilical cord blood transplantation. Advanced diagnostics tracked tissue damage progression and multi-organ involvement. Clinical teams documented dose-response relationships in real time. These cases refined understanding of thresholds for irreversible bone marrow damage and the progression of multi-organ failure following mixed-field, high-dose exposure. The workers' injuries became detailed case studies of radiation biology at extreme dose levels. Medical publications described the JCO cases as among the most severe whole-body radiation accidents in Japan, contributing significant data on the clinical course of high-dose mixed-field exposure. The documentation included detailed records of symptom onset, organ system failure patterns, and response to interventions. The accident translated abstract sievert values into specific clinical realities. Outcomes. Ouchi and Shinohara died months after the accident from multi-organ failure despite aggressive treatment. Yokokawa, with a significantly lower dose, survived with long-term medical follow-up. The workers' injuries and documented clinical courses became reference points for future emergency preparedness, treatment planning, and risk communication in high-dose radiation scenarios worldwide. While clinicians documented the medical consequences in detail, policymakers and regulators began drafting new rules. The final phase shows how quantitative data from Tokai-mura reshaped Japan's nuclear emergency framework. Late 1999 through early 2000s, Tokyo and nationwide. In a committee room at the National Diet, draft text for emergency preparedness legislation covers legislators' desks. Tables in the annexes list not only power reactors, but also fuel fabrication facilities, research installations, and other nuclear operations. Before JCO, national emergency frameworks primarily targeted large reactor accidents with potential for major releases. After the accident, lawmakers and regulators recognized that smaller fuel facilities could produce scenarios requiring evacuation and sheltering, even without widespread contamination. The Japanese government, Nuclear Safety Commission, local authorities, and plant operators participated in drafting and implementing new regulations. International bodies, including the International Atomic Energy Agency, provided technical context and comparative analysis. Key regulatory changes included enactment of comprehensive nuclear emergency legislation, explicitly covering all nuclear facilities. The Act on Special Measures Concerning Nuclear Emergency Preparedness was passed in December 1999 and enforced from June 2000. Emergency planning zones were broadened to include areas around fuel cycle sites. Inspection frequency and scope at fuel fabrication plants increased substantially. Emergency inspections were conducted at 20 fuel cycle facilities nationwide. Lessons from Tokai-mura were integrated into international guidance on fuel cycle safety. The United States Nuclear Regulatory Commission incorporated JCO findings into risk-informed, performance-based oversight frameworks for fuel cycle facilities. Government summaries note that the JCO accident triggered a fundamental reinforcement of Japan's nuclear emergency preparedness system, including expanded coverage of non-reactor installations and improved coordination between facility operators and local authorities. Measured doses, evacuation counts, and technical reconstruction findings from Tokai-mura provided the empirical basis for legal and regulatory amendments. The accident demonstrated that fuel solution facilities could produce unique emergency scenarios distinct from reactor accidents, requiring tailored response capabilities. With laws changed and the plant's uranium conversion operations permanently shut down, one question remained. How would the accident be recorded in long-term monitoring data, compensation records, and international safety literature, 2000s through present? Tokai-mura, Tokyo, and International Nuclear Safety Community. A summary table in an International Atomic Energy Agency Lessons Learned report lists final numbers from the accident: 3 severely exposed workers, 2 deaths from radiation injuries, 667 people receiving measurable radiation doses above background, hundreds of residents temporarily evacuated, 1 fuel conversion line permanently closed. The conversion test building was designed as a modest-scale fuel solution processing line with criticality prevented by geometry and administrative controls. Its accident became one of the most frequently cited case studies in nuclear fuel cycle history, referenced worldwide in criticality safety training, regulatory reviews, and emergency planning exercises. Japanese government agencies, the International Atomic Energy Agency, and criticality safety organizations cite JCO in official guidance documents and training materials. Residents of Tokai-mura appear in statistical summaries of dose assessment and compensation programs, documented without unnecessary personal detail. Long-term outcomes include completion of final dose and health assessments for all affected populations. No long-term deterministic health effects were confirmed outside the facility among the general public or emergency responders. Compensation and legal settlements were arranged for residents, workers, and local entities affected by the accident and evacuation. JCO accident data were incorporated into criticality safety handbooks, nuclear emergency planning assumptions, and case-based training programs internationally. The accident validated the importance of inherently safe design, procedural discipline, and active regulatory oversight in fuel solution handling. A lessons learned document concludes that criticality prevention in fuel solution facilities must be ensured not only by administrative controls, but by inherently safe geometries and robust regulatory oversight that verifies actual practices against approved procedures. The conversion. Test building itself was eventually decommissioned. Monitoring confirmed no long-term environmental contamination requiring remediation. The site remains part of Japan's nuclear industrial landscape, now marked by the absence of operations rather than their presence. The accident's quantitative record, masses, geometries, sieverts, evacuation counts, legislative titles, compensation figures, became a long-term reference set in nuclear safety literature. It demonstrated concretely how a process geometry violation in a single industrial building could alter national emergency law and international safety practice. Tokai-mura established a principle now embedded in regulatory frameworks worldwide. In fuel solution handling, geometry, operational discipline, and regulatory verification are inseparable elements of safety. When one element weakens, the others must already be strong enough to prevent a process tank from assembling a critical mass. The JCO criticality accident is now a standard case study. It appears in training courses, regulatory guidance, and technical conferences. The story is told not as an unpredictable disaster, but as a documented sequence: approved design, procedural drift, organizational failure, regulatory gap, and physical consequence. The numbers remain: 16.8 kilograms of uranium solution, 18.8% enrichment, 2.4 kilogram design limit, exceeded by a factor of 7, 19 hours of criticality, 3 workers at the tank, 2 deaths, 667 people dosed, 1 law passed, 1 conversion line closed. Those numbers tell a story of how an elementary rule, respect the geometry, respect the mass limit, was quietly broken for years, and how, on 30 September 1999, in a small building on the Japanese coast, a bucket became the tool that assembled a critical mass and forced a nation to rewrite its understanding of nuclear fuel safety. The final lesson is simple and enduring. Process geometry cannot be bypassed with buckets. Schedules cannot override physics, and paperwork cannot substitute for verification. Tokai-mura proved that when those principles fail, a precipitation tank can go critical, and a case study can last generations.